Hello and welcome back to another episode of Franklin Covey's On Leadership podcast. My name is Scott Miller. I serve as your host and interviewer each week, twice weekly on Tuesdays and Fridays. We're now for 6 years and nearly 400 episodes. I have the privilege of interviewing some of the world's most influential thought leaders, whether they are authors, researchers, academics, practitioners, CEOs, business titans from all walks of life. We try to pressurize conversations in the hopes of making you a better leader. Franklin Covey, of course, the world's most trusted leadership development firm, co-founded by the incomparable author Stephen R. Covey. His book, of course, was The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This book sold nearly 60 million copies and has spawned a global footprint for Franklin Covey to partner with organizations in every form and fashion. Today, our guest is the author of the book Inner Mastery, Outer Impact, how your 5 core energies hold the key to success. The author is Hitendra Wadwha. He is a professor at Columbia, former McKinsey consultant as well, and just deep, thoughtful person. This is the kind of podcast where you might want to pause for a moment. Go steep yourself a cup of tea or a cup of hot coffee, sit back in a comfortable chair, and just listen in, because I think you'll have some profound insights on how you can differentiate between inner mastery and outer impact, and how some of us tend to chase the wrong things. We know it, but my sense is today Hitendra is going to give us a roadmap for how to better focus our time. To that point, Hitendra, welcome to On Leadership.
Thank you. Real pleasure to be here, Scott.
Thoroughly enjoyed your book. This is not the kind of book you read on a flight. This is the kind of book that you absorb and digest and read 3 or 4 pages, put it down, come back to, do some self-reflection. You've written kind of a handbook for life more than, if you would, a leadership book. Before we dive into some of your concepts, why don't you walk us through what has been your academic and professional journey, what your passions are, and how you came to write this specific book?
Sure, I appreciate that. By the way, just on what you said about the book, when I finished writing it, I remember walking over to my wife and saying, I think I can die in peace. I just felt that there was a certain culminating aspect to that moment with all that I'd striven to codify in the book. I also want to honor the legacy of Stephen Covey, since I am on the Franklin Covey podcast. He has been a big inspiration for me. The pioneering work he did to bring, in a sense, the spiritual and material together, the personal and professional together, to codify it in very practical principles, yet very inspiring and timeless in so many ways, was a big influence on me, early in my career. And so it's just an honor, Scott, to just be here. About your question, yeah. So I grew up in India. And my early passion was twofold. One is mathematics, and the other is mysticism. Through both, I was really questing for truth, precise, deep, timeless truths. And so mysticism became the journey of my inner quest, and mathematics my outer quest. I majored in math in college, came to the United States, went to graduate school, to do an MBA and a PhD at MIT in business, but really, it was MIT. It was really, for me, a place of further quantitative exploration of, analytical, mathematical models of business. After that, I went to McKinsey and Company to do strategy consulting for a few years. I wanted to broaden my horizons. Went to Silicon Valley, did a startup. And when that wrapped up in 2002, I ended up feeling really pulled from within towards asking some of these harder, deeper, bigger questions about life and purpose and what am I meant to manifest. And I came over to New York. I was doing some consulting with a couple of major banks on Wall Street when that sort of inner sort of draw came to me for wanting to reconnect with academia, to re-engage with the enterprise of teaching and nurturing and developing the next generation. And as I started to do that, initially at Wharton and Columbia Business School, ultimately getting a home as a professor of practice at Columbia Business School, I realized that my kind of real platform that I wanted to create was one where I could, in a way, sort of modernize in the latest kind of scientific research-backed sort of language some of these timeless principles of how we flourish, how we can pursue a very noble, purpose-driven life and yet engage with the messy milieu of what's around us, in the world, the challenges, the egos, the attachments, the opportunities, and everything in between. And so that led to a class on personal leadership and success. That has been my mainstay at the Business School of Columbia. I'm honored to have won, the Dean's Award for Teaching Excellence because the class became very popular, and over time led to the formation of my institute called the Mentora Institute, through which we do a couple of things. One is organizational culture and leadership and performance acceleration work, founded on this inner mastery, outer impact model. And the other, through our nonprofit, is to help parlay some of this into programming for youth as well.
Hitendra, let's revisit part of that, because as I understand it, a key inflection point in your career, in your thinking, and your momentum was this experience at Columbia where you transitioned from an expertise and even a passion around traditional MBA level courses, marketing, business, things like that, and you took a risk and you designed a new course, and your colleagues supported it, and you weren't quite sure how it would be received by the students. I mean, listen, Columbia Business School is the cream of the crop, and you go there to learn how to become a business titan. Will you just rewind a little bit and talk about your apprehension around how it would be received, and then how students, in fact, received this fairly big pivot in a curriculum that you were passionate about, but you weren't quite sure how they would be?
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. So I had, in my initial couple of years, been teaching classes on marketing and innovation and strategic problem solving. And what was happening is that I was falling deeply in love, with my students, with their futures, with the capacity that we have as professors to help influence and shape their growth. And so at one point, I was asking myself, what are the most important truths that I have been blessed to over time receive, learn, assimilate, and why should I not offer those to these, that my extended family, these students are kind of going out to, make their place in the world. And so at one point, at the end of the semester, I ran an experiment where in my final class, I just paused, from the marketing frameworks and all that I was teaching, and said, the last 15 minutes, I don't know if and when our paths will cross again. But I want to therefore use this as an opportunity to offer up to you what I think are the most important truths that I've learned and experienced in life. And I shared 3 stories with them, with 3 truths to them. And after that class, one of the students, came up to me and said, Professor, I really appreciated the class. Thank you so much for all that you've taught us over the semester. And I want to say that these last 15 minutes were for me the most valuable. The most valuable, that really sort of lit me up. And I really credit the student, and I feel so grateful because it sort of propelled me towards saying, Hitendra, do more work on this, do more research on it, think this through more, create a more structured curriculum around this. I ended up then spending about 2-3 years really being a student of human nature. I had my mystical leanings, from the years, my own spiritual practice and all that, which was very informative. But I wanted to catch up on the latest science on that. So I toured the country, met with some of the leading psychotherapists like Dr. David Burns from Stanford University and Dan Siegel from UCLA, and some of the leading psychologists like Carol Dweck, who was at Stanford. And I integrated some of the latest kind of scientific thinking about human nature, which I found to be refreshingly very consistent with the timeless truths, of spiritual wisdom from the ages. If Stephen Covey had been alive now and had been actually witnessing some of this explosive, powerful fusion that is starting to happen between science and spirituality, I think he would be so excited. And then, so I took that. I also started to study the lives of storied leaders from history, a Mother Teresa or a Mahatma Gandhi or a Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela or even a Steve Jobs or Warren Buffett. And I found that there were actually a lot of commonalities across, the science, the stories, and spiritual wisdom. So that's what I codified into my class. I shopped it around with my faculty colleagues, and it took about a couple of years to kind of open up the community to it. But to their credit, I'm very, very grateful that they allowed me to run this initially as an experiment, a pilot, and then when the students really voted with their own sort of just bidding for class points and all of that, I know that we hit a home run. So.
To our listeners and viewers around the world, this is not a book review podcast. It happens to be that most of our guests have written a book that we tend to congeal our conversation around. And I don't typically, review the chapters of books, but the way your book is organized, I'm going to actually have you to opine on each of these 5 energies. To remind our listeners, our guest's title is Inner Mastery, Outer Impact, how your 5 core energies hold the key to success. And I'm going to ask you to touch on each of these. We're going to dive deeper into the second one called wisdom, because you share a fascinating story about a student in your class. You name her Maria, and about some misconceptions you had about her level of engagement. And then we're going to go deeper into what you call 5 common mental distortions. I'll pitch them to you so you don't have to remember them. But for our listeners and viewers, the 5 core energies are living and leading with purpose, living and leading with wisdom. We'll go deeper into that. Living and leading with growth, living and leading with love, and finally, living and leading with self-realization. We're going to spend about 3 or 4 minutes on each of these with a deeper dive on the second one. Because I'm the host, I get to pick around wisdom. Hitendra, would you first start and kind of give us a quick TED Talk, short, on what it means to both live and lead with purpose?
Purpose is about having a North Star, having a certain grounding as to why you're pursuing, and what you're pursuing. And to me, the power of purpose is to infuse a sense of noble intention in everything we do, and to therefore be making sure that you are cleansed of any kind of like personal attachments or ego or insecurities in taking the kind of actions that you are in directing your energies towards that North Star. It can be large purpose, as in what's the purpose of my life? What is the purpose of my profession, the work that I do, the organization that I'm a part of? But it can also be small purpose. I found it very transformative when we can train individuals, managers, leaders, individual contributors, as well as their teams, to have a very clear, positive intention to every conversation, to every interaction, every presentation, every decision, every meeting. And sometimes that's hard because you have rejected the possibilities before you walk into the room. You feel like, oh, this person is never going to get it. Finance will never agree with marketing. I'm worried and concerned. I really wish somebody else was doing this, not me. So positive intention is an example of small purpose where in the moment you commit yourself to seeing a sense of possibilities, a sense of positive possibilities in every moment to accelerate trust or to deepen understanding, build a ground of empathy, or just take that sort of first step towards some kind of mutual engagement. So that's purpose.
The book is organized around these 5 core energies. First, living and leading with purpose. Second, living and leading with wisdom. Expand on that.
Yeah. I want to just very quickly say one more afterthought on purpose. The value of having the purpose means that you get very anchored from within in your quest, in your North Star, but you get very agile and adaptive from without. In other words, from the outside, you can be very flexible based on, what conditions are happening and unfolding around you. You can roll with the punches, but that flexibility on the outside is still very anchored and grounded in that energy of purpose on the inside. Wisdom, the way I've sort of proposed defining it, is the questing for truth in all situations, because the truth, after all, can set us free. Truth is about recognizing that from time to time, we have filters, we have biases, we have kind of ways in which we like to process and think and pay attention to certain facts and not to others, and perhaps ignore the fact that this person in front of us is pausing uncomfortably or may have not really taken our idea really well. And, rather than kind of pay attention to that and honor that and perhaps go into a process of a little bit more discovery about that, we tend to brush off, certain signals, certain subtle, whispers that the universe is actually making to us to open our minds up to a more objective, balanced, complete, rational understanding of life. And so wisdom is about as much mastering your emotions as it is about untwisting your thoughts, challenging any limiting beliefs you have, giving up any kind of, just attachments that might be blindsiding you, and therefore freeing yourself up to both look at life in a very analytical, logical way, but also tap freely into your intuition.
So I'd like to go deeper into this because At the age of 56, and having read a few thousand books and written a few of my own, and spent my entire multi-decade career in the leadership business, a discipline that I am working on in myself is learning when not to connect things that shouldn't be connected. And like everybody, I have paranoias, I have jealousies, I have fears, I make stuff up. I recognize that my brain doesn't always tell me the truth. It sometimes lures me down unhealthy paths. I'll connect something like, this person is ghosting me, and this book I've written hasn't sold well, and my downloads are lower this week than last week on this podcast, therefore I'm irrelevant. And so, or any number of things that I connect together that shouldn't be connected. Now, sometimes there are connections that should be connected to see themes about how I'm being received or my relevance, but it's something I'm working on. And your book spoke to me in this particular chapter around wisdom. What I'd like you to do is, could you reshare with some detail your experience with this student that you name, quote, Maria, and some assumptions you made about her level of engagement. And then I'd like you to dive deep into what you call the 5 common mental distortions. Tell the Maria story, and I'm going to pitch you the 5 and have you maybe riff on each of those. I think this is so valuable for our listeners. Tell the Maria story, I'll pitch you the 5 common mental distortions.
Yeah, well, thank you for connecting into your own, foibles. We all have them. Yeah, so this is a moment that occurred in my class about 10 odd, 12 odd years ago. I was teaching a class on strategy, and I found this one student, Maria, to be highly disengaged. And one lecture happens, the second one happens, and she's still very disengaged. I would come out of the class some days feeling very low, and sometimes it was about, Hitendra, you're so incompetent as a professor because look, you are not teaching something engaging and relevant. How disengaged she was today, Maria. On other days, I would come out feeling, wow, this Maria, she's just so unmotivated academically. Why do we admit students like this to Columbia Business School? She's just here for networking and for getting a job. And then around the middle of the semester, she comes up to me and she says, Professor, can I have a word with you? And I said, sure, what's going on, Maria? And she says, Professor, I don't know if you noticed, but I've been really quite disengaged in class. And I'm rolling my eyes inside my mind. I'm like, oh yeah, of course I know that. So now is it going to be the moment where you'll tell me what's going on? But from the outside, I just say, yeah, Maria, tell me more. What, how are you doing? And she said, well, the reason for that is because, over the summer, my father passed away. And since then, I've just found real struggle to have much engagement with life. It's just, I'm still, really processing that loss. And I'm not engaged in your class. I'm not engaged in that class and not in that class. And I'm not going for any job interviews right now. And, I'm really kind of pulling away from going to student parties and things. And meanwhile, the semester is going by. I'm in my second year. I've invested a lot in being in business school. And it's concerning to me that I'm not being able to fully make peace, with the loss of a very dear and loved soul in my life, and recapture, the imperative of being in business school. Could you help me? Because I know you teach this class on personal leadership. Can you imagine what a fool I felt like in that moment? In imagining that this was all about me being incompetent or about her being just kind of a unmotivated student. So that was the Maria story, which taught me a lot of lessons about the silent suffering at times inner lives of professors.
Well, you actually share many vulnerable moments like that you teach through, which is why you're such a renowned teacher. Let's take a few moments and sort of debrief some teaching moments around that. You follow that story in the book under the section of wisdom, leading and living with wisdom, with what you call 5 common mental distortions: mind reading, mental filtering, labeling, blame, and all or nothing thinking. And my hope is that this is a great takeaway for all of our listeners and viewers. Will you take a few minutes and talk about the first mental distortion called mind reading?
Mind reading is where you just assume that you know what the other person is thinking or feeling. And you just start acting on the basis of your assumed understanding of that person's inner life. So in this case, for example, when this lady, Maria, was disengaged in class, I just assumed it's because she's not connecting with what's happening in the class. She's judging my material to be irrelevant or uninteresting to her. Or on other days, I assume that she's not engaged because she's just not academically motivated. That was an example of mind reading because, of course, the truth was very different.
mental filtering.
Yeah. Mental filtering is where you selectively pay attention to certain pieces of information and completely ignore the rest of what, the universe is, showcasing to you. So we go into a meeting and, there are 5 people there and one person at times makes a certain remark. And that's kind of mostly what we remember about the meeting because that remark was critical of us. We don't remember anything else about the rest of the meeting because we just are highlighting that one thing and filtering out the rest. In this case, for instance, I was having 46 students in the class, and she was disengaged. What about the other 45? Somehow, that didn't matter to me. I was judging the quality of the class on the basis of the least engaged student. So that's mental filtering.
I have an honorary doctorate in mental filtering. When I read your book, I thought, oh my gosh, how many times have I been? And I served as the chief marketing officer of Franklin Covey for nearly a decade. And so I was on the executive team, this global public company. And the CEO and I had a very great relationship. I was, I think, a linchpin on his team. And then as he began to decide to transition out of the CEO role into the chairmanship role, he began to designate one of my peers as his successor, which was not a surprise to anyone. I wrestled with that for a little bit, but came to terms with it. But he obviously started to disproportionately invest his time and interest in my colleague. And I very much felt abandoned by it. And I interpreted everything as about a slight to me, as opposed to, no, he's got the future of the company to think about, and the shareholders and the employees. And so, yes, I was in my mid-50s. I'm apologized and embarrassed to admit, but I think this idea of recognizing how dangerous mental filtering can be, especially when we put our own egos at the center of it. Do you have any tips on how someone can we all mentally filter. Any tips from your own wisdom around how we can be more aware of when that is happening and either prevent it or turn it into perhaps a positive?
Yeah. No, thank you again for sharing your own personal moments with us and struggle with it. So the thing that I've learned from the work of cognitive behavior therapists, like the pioneering work of Dr. David Burns, is that often the signal first comes to us through our emotional state. And so we may in a certain moment be feeling very despondent, very discouraged, very dispirited about something, maybe angry or irritated or anxious. And so in a moment like that, where you feel, what? My emotional state is not really allowing me to play my best game. I'm not fully attending to this dinner that I'm supposed to have with my loved ones. I am in this meeting and part of me is getting a little bit roused up in a way that may not be landing well on others or etc. Right? Whatever that might be for you. When you detect that emotional state, then ask yourself, what is triggering it? What's causing it? What's one event or situation that's causing it? And when you look at that event or situation, it could be something like what you just said, that my CEO, who's going to be the future chairman, is spending so much time with the CEO, heir apparent, right? And rather than spending more time with me. And so you take that event and then you ask yourself, what are the thoughts that are causing me to feel so anxious, so angry, so what have you? And the thought might be that he doesn't care for me, or look how much time he gave this other individual and not me. That's where you start to sense, I think I am mental filtering here. I think I'm over exaggerating like certain observations and not others. After all, he did take that very warm walk with me yesterday, and I got so much insight from that. After all, we are seeing a transition happen here, and during the transition, I should expect that he is going to have to spend more time with this individual. But when I look at that and that and that and that, there's enough evidence and data here to show that when I balance things out, rather than just mentally filter, that I'm actually in a pretty good place in terms of my dynamics and relationship with this individual. So you start to counteract your own thinking. But to get there, you have to first surface your thinking. And to surface your thinking, it helps to anchor in a particular event or situation. And these events and situations are the ones that are triggering you.
Hitendra, your book was a gift to me because, I consider myself to be a very successful podcast host and author and keynote speaker. Like I said, my entire career was in the leadership development industry, sold hundreds of millions of dollars of leadership solutions to companies and organizations around the world. And what you taught me is, in this book, I make everything about me. And this is not an epiphany to a lot of my friends and family and colleagues, but I took away that it's not healthy, that I tend to turn so many touch points and insights and comments, and most of them aren't about me. I've just turned them into something about me. And this is, I know my friends are going to laugh and say, news flash, Scott, but hey, better to learn at 56 than to not have learned at all. And so your book was a great gift to me. Right now, we're talking about the 5 common mental distortions: mind reading, mental filtering. Next, you call it labeling.
Labeling is where we ascribe certain very sort of unflattering, usually, language, to situations or to ourselves or to people. Like, I'm such a fool, or this person is, such an idiot or such a loser, or, what an utter failure, or I'm disgusted. These words like failure, disgust, fool, loser. If you think about it, they're very monolithic, i.e., they don't leave any room, for doubt or for alternative interpretations or for nuance. And they also carry a strong emotional surge in them. When you just kind of use the word, this person is a loser, in your mind, the neurons are firing in a way which associates, that word with all the kinds of things that you have experienced over the course of life about what losers are and what they do and don't do, and etc. They don't work hard, they don't think that, carefully, and etc., right? And so the reason it's a distortion, the reason it is something to be cautious about, is because in most cases, the situation isn't as radicalized, isn't as extreme, isn't as monolithic. For example, somebody shows up, at a meeting with you and doesn't bring their laptop. And meanwhile, the file they hadn't put it on the cloud. It was on their laptop, and that's the file that you had to use for that presentation. Now you might say, what an idiot. But if the definition of an idiot is somebody who forgets something really critical in a high stakes moment, well, I have to raise my hand and say I forgot my passport once. Once I had to fly out of New York to London and I didn't have my passport with me. Someone else might remember that they forgot their keys somewhere. My father once forgot my mother, when they came out of a friend's home and they were to, sit in the car and leave, and, he had to take a turn and come back because he happily left and he was talking to his wife, and then he wasn't hearing any affirmations until he realized that she wasn't there, so any or all of us have been, if you want to call it, idiots in that way. And then, well, if everybody's an idiot, then when somebody's forgotten that important document or that, laptop of theirs, instead of saying what an idiot, you can just say, what a human being, because it's like quite human now and then to do that.
I think it's such an important point. One of my favorite books of all time is written by Robin Sharma. And he, of course, wrote the book, The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. But the book that I love he wrote is called The Everyday Hero Manifesto. And one of the points he teaches in this book is how important it is to be very cautious and deliberate with our language, the words we use to describe others, other situations. He's a man of extraordinary deliberation in the words that he uses. One of my favorite chapters in his book is about someone stole his journals. And he talks about kind of the day my journals went missing. And it says how he frames it has an impact on his mindset. I didn't quote that right, but I love this point around how we label people, ourselves, situations, circumstances. It leads to your next mental distortion called blame. Talk about that.
Blame is very interesting because what happens is when things don't go right in our life, when we suffer through a certain disappointment, struggle of some kind, there is this human tendency to want to vilify. We want to be able to find a certain villain in the piece. And sometimes for some of us, the tendency is for self-blame. We tend to blame our own self, like, oh, I was responsible for this. I was so wrong about this. And we go into a downward spiral about our own sense of self-worth and self-esteem. In other cases, people tend to have the tendency of wanting to blame others. And so blaming others and or blaming yourself. Now, look, in some situations, it may be a perfectly appropriate thing to do because through that blame comes a sense of accountability and responsibility and ownership and learning and growth and adjustment and new commitments and what have you. And so all power to you. If actually you find that, the blaming that is happening in the team is leading to that kind of a very positive sense of ownership, great, stay with it. But instead, if it is leading to acrimony, if it is leading to a sense of mistrust, if it's leading to premature judgments, then from that vantage point, you may want to be sort of cautious because in some situations, you may be rushing to judgment before you actually knew what the root cause was. For example, again, in that story with Maria, in that classroom, here I was coming out of the class, seeing that she was disengaged. I hadn't achieve the outcome I want professorially, but like I wasn't to blame, she wasn't to blame. And yet there were times when I was blaming myself and there were times when I was blaming her.
Hitendra, I sometimes think that this podcast is really just the world's attempt to have an intervention with me as a leader, as a parent, as a spouse, because your book really spoke to me. About a week ago, I'm an entrepreneur, so my day job is I'm a literary talent and speaking agent. And I podcast and do a lot of other things for Franklin Covey and myself. And a week ago, one of the authors that we were supporting their book launch, we had designed a box, to send out to influencers and CEOs where their book would be in this box. And the box was designed wrong. It was like 1 inch too small on one side and 2 inches too small on another. And I called up the colleague who designed it, and he said, yeah, you're talking to the wrong guy. You need to call Mark. Mark's the one that gave me the dimensions. So I call up Mark, not his name. And Mark says, and I said, Mark, what happened? Have you gotten these people on the phone to figure out what happened? And Mark said to me, well, I didn't spend my time finding blame. I just wanted to solve the problem. And I stopped him. I said, Mark, it isn't about finding blame. It's about creating responsibility and accountability. I'm not trying to blame anyone. I said, I feel like you've used the word blame because you didn't want to hold anybody accountable. I feel like you pulled the chicken switch by saying, well, I don't want to blame anybody. I said, no, it's not about blame, but it is about naming responsibility. Where did this break down? Was it you? Was it her? Was it him? And I felt like that was his attempt to try to get out of owning responsibility, including if it was somebody else, that would require a high courage conversation, moving outside of your comfort zone, getting someone to acknowledge their responsibility. Do you think I'm off track on that in terms of sometimes blame is more about just making sure everyone involved is responsible and accountable, including yourself, for the results of a situation?
Yeah, I really appreciate that very much. I think, each of these distortions, we shouldn't, in the conversation we were just having, we shouldn't assume that you should never mind read. There are situations where you need to sense and attune yourself to what the other party is thinking or feeling, and they're not in front of you. They're on another continent and you're exchanging emails, and you have a world of wisdom, in you, in your past relationship with them and what you know about them. And it makes sense for you to have some hypotheses about how they might be feeling, given the kind of email that they've just sent you. You may want to inquire to confirm, but the idea of not allowing yourself to ever make those leaps of faith, is not what this conversation is about. What this conversation is about is in those situations where you're feeling like it's not working, something is, kind of just unnecessarily negative, about the situation. That's where you want to be very cautious about whether you're falling into some of these traps in a way that is unproductive, right? But exactly to your point, and I much appreciate the way you were responding and coaching your colleague there. The idea that like blaming is kind of unhealthy, which is what he was bringing up, is not inconsistent with the idea that attributing ownership and responsibility and holding ourselves accountable to an appropriately high standard, that those are good things to do as well.
Okay, finish off the last of the 5 common mental distortions after mind reading, mental filtering, labeling, blame is all or nothing thinking. Give us a minute on that. We'll land the conversation.
That's when you approach life with the view that, either you're a hero or you're a zero. Either, you love living in the city or you hate living in the city. Either this person is like a genius or they're a fool. Any of these kind of whiplash, black and white ways of thinking, which painfully so, have been further accentuated today with the dynamics of social media, where we get fed with emotionally charged, very sort of polarized content based on your profile and your, et cetera. So society is moving more and more towards this instinct, wanting to very quickly put people into either these are my friends or then these are my enemies. So this kind of way of thinking, rather than a more nuanced shades of gray way of thinking, where you can start to understand life in a more multifaceted way, know that the same situation can have both positive and negative to it. The same individual can have strengths to them as well as development gaps to them. You yourself may have, failed in a certain moment, but you also had a number of other, successes and strengths to you and virtues to you, et cetera. And so being able to understand when we get polarized in our thinking and, in a very cautious way, challenging, that sort of, position that we are mentally, emotionally taking on somebody, and perhaps kind of pulling us back into a frame of greater balance so that we can make informed and thoughtful judgments about what conversations to have.
Hitendra, your book is full of insights like this. I just chose today to focus our conversation because I thought this was so instrumental, and not just in the workplace setting, but in our friendships, in our love relationships, in our parent relationships. The book is a masterpiece. I chose to spend our time on this, but I want to land our conversation quickly on what are the 5 core energies. We talked about purpose and wisdom. Would you just take maybe a minute each on the last 3, which are growth, love, and then self-realization?
Yeah, thank you. Growth is about recognizing that within each of us lies a very special place. I call that your inner core. You might call that your spirit or your soul. And that is from where your true self and your best self arises. When you're at your core, then you're able to transcend habit and personality and be just deeply committed to a noble purpose and doing beautiful things. And growth is about recognizing that we drift in and out of that space. We're not always there. And when we're not there, we're maybe struggling a little bit with life. And when we are there, we feel, even though things might not be always perfect from the outside, we feel very anchored in that core on the inside. And so what is it that we do every day as a discipline, step by step, to stay anchored in the core, to make sure that when we are operating in the arena of life, we are as much as possible projecting these energies from the core. And if we stumble and fail and fall, that's okay. That's just the nature of the journey of life. We can always learn, adjust, and then re-anchor in the core. So that quest is growth. Love is, the way I propose and I define it, is that it's about taking joy in other people's joy. That's what happens when you fall in love. That's what happens when you have a child. Their joy becomes your joy. Even small, simple acts of that little beautiful piece of life, being able to move from just purely crawling to taking their first walk gives such a sense of victory to you. So finding success in other people's success, taking joy in their joy, that is the capacity that each of us have for boundless, universal, unconditional, selfless love. And if we can manifest that in the workplace, naturally so, you will create more empathetic and more caring managers who are more invested in developing their people and just more attuned to the inner life of the organization because they're attuned to the joy of others. And so that's love. And the last one, self-realization, is about recognizing that, besides the outer arena, of our behaviors and our engagement with the world, and then if you want to call it the inner arena of our thoughts and emotions, there lies a space within us of pure stillness, of pure sense of being. And we all need, as human beings, a practice through which we can renew, regenerate, rejuvenate our spirit. And for that, whether it's walks in nature or journaling or prayer or chanting or meditation or talks with people who truly inspire you and connect you with the purity of your heart, we all need that. We need regular investments in that as a way to constantly reaffirm, the special gifts, the special intuitions, the special inklings we have at the very core of our being.
Tell me what mysticism is. As a guy that was raised in Florida and Chicago and Utah as, a religious person in a religious family, Western religion, if you will, Christianity. It's no secret I've been raised as a Catholic and raising my sons as a Catholic. Maybe re-level set to everybody. You have a lot of research and experience in mysticism. What does that mean for the common listener like me? And what are some insights in our last minute or two we might take from not having been very exposed to that?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It is, in some ways, to me, the ultimate step, the ultimate quest, and that's why it's the last chapter of my book. And to me, mysticism is about recognizing that there is a force out there in the world, the creative force that is omnipotent, so it is all powerful. It is omniscient, which means it knows everything. It is all pervading, which means it's everywhere, i.e. omnipresent. And it's also all loving, which means that all it seeks and wants is to ultimately help us get to a source of infinite, boundless joy. So it starts with that view that there is this divine, mystical, mysterious, creative force out there. Then what it says is that you and I, we have all emerged from it. We are not distant from it. We are not apart from it. We are part of it. Just like from gold, the only thing you can get is gold. from that creative, pure, beautiful, joyful, loving, force out there, the only thing you can get is creative, powerful, beautiful, loving souls, and that's what you are, and that's what I am. And yet, what has happened is that we have, with distractions and and seductions and everything else in our life, we have at times gotten so invested in just the material aspect of creation that we have lost a sense of attunement and identity and affirmation about who we are, the very core of our being, which is that very joy, that very love, that very wisdom that we are seeking on the outside is who we are on the inside. And therefore, the quest of life, really, in the mystical sense, is to go on that joyful, adventuresome path of discovery. The discovery, which is as much about your inner space as it is about what's happening in the, in the material sort of distractions of the world on the outside, i.e., who am I truly on the inside? What's my relationship with the universe? And the more we take steps towards that, and we reframe, our sense of identity and our sense of self, less on the basis of purely the age of our body and et cetera, and more on the basis of that spirit to spirit connection between us and other human beings and life in general and the universe at large, the more we start to feel transformed in our understanding of how to deal with the complexities of life. Everything starts to get integrated, and at one point you realize, oh my heavens, this is all a view of a certain conductor out there conducting a cosmic symphony of which I'm playing a certain role with the musical instrument that I'm meant to manifest in my life.
Dr. Hitendra Wadwha, you are the founder of the Mentor Institute, professor at the Columbia Business School. You are the author of the recent book, Inner Mastery, Outer Impact, How Your 5 Core Energies Hold the Key to Success. This really is not a book about leadership as much as it is a book about how to be a good human being. I mean, I wish I kind of would have had your book 30 years ago, and I've read every leadership book there is out there. It is a leadership book. It is a business book. It's a book on how to build a culture where people choose to come and stay and choose engagement. I learned so much about myself, maybe horrifyingly, at 56 years old as the father of 3 young boys and as a husband and as a friend and an entrepreneur, as a podcast host. Your book is not the kind of book you read on a flight. Like I said when we opened, this is a book that if you want to learn more about yourself and maybe further define what is your purpose, what is the difference between outer impact and outer success, and have a more introspective relationship with yourself, Inner Mastery, Outer Impact is the read for you. Hitendra Wadwha, thank you for joining us today.
Real joy and pleasure to be here with you, Scott. Real honor to be, talking on this podcast and something so connected with Stephen Covey, as I mentioned. There's a French Nobel laureate in literature who once said that, if you want to measure, a human being's character, do it not on the basis of which books they read, but which books they reread. And that's my aspiration here, is to put a book on the shelf that hopefully, you and others will have value in going back and rereading, not just reading, because the ideas and thoughts that I've really, captured there are those that I know from me in my life have had repeated value, over the course of time. Grateful and honored to be here.
Well, I will have to recover from my first reading before I can actually get back in, because I've got to make some fixes and some solutions before then. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.